My name is Anthony Galloway. I am going for my MDiv here at United in the Social Transformation Program. I am a licentiate, meaning I'm licensed to preach in the AME Church, and I'm going through the African Methodist Episcopal Church or AME Church's ordination process. So my context. So the context and the challenge with the context that I'm currently in, I'm in a predominantly African American and Afrocentric space, both in my church ministry experience at St. James AME Church, and as the executive director of the Center for the African Diaspora, the Arts Us Center for the African Diaspora, here in St. Paul. And so a lot of my work and my world revolves around healthy identity development in Black diasporic communities. Um, and so the contextual challenge that I'm most constantly battling is anti-Black sentiments and mindsets that hinder the development of healthy African diasporic identities, both internally and externally. And so a lot of the things that I'm running into center around kind of three areas. One is a really messed up sense of history, the things that we don't know, should know, or know erroneously historically. And then a conversation about our current identity and context, right? The our internal ethnic identities within our, if we look at it from a pan African diasporic lens, we have a lot of identities that go along with our in our communities, whether newly arrived African peoples who have different cultural identities, or the different cultural identities here with multi-generational African American peoples who have a history through the slave trade in the Caribbean and in the Americas, that are all vying for I don't know, to assert identity, right? I don't want to lose the cultural center that I've been brought up in, while struggling with this with a pan ethnicity kind of forced upon us, while struggling with the racial identity that you are perceived to be in, and all the racial issues that happen here in the United States. And so I'm finding that um, trying to assert a Black Christian identity in particular, right, is even tougher, because so much of our Christian identity has been given back to us from a Eurocentric space. So all of those are converging in the church context and in the nonprofit world, where we do African storytelling, drumming. We look at the history and the science of African peoples, and I am finding routinely that we're not moving the needle on growing a collective consciousness that understands and knows a lot of these different pieces of our own history, our own rich history, and being able to view it as a rich history. And so I find that we are growing less equipped, instead of more equipped, less equipped to engage and sustain an unapologetic Black identity that supports current efforts for equity effectively. In a sense, we are, and I wrote this in the paper, we are lacking an understanding of who we were, struggling to define who we are, and thus struggling with a vision of who we want to be in a context that's not bound and in constant reference to white supremacy or white normativity. And so, from the historical standpoint, you know, just even in recent history in the United States, we are still telling a story of Rosa Parks as a tired old lady who didn't give up her seat, right? And disregarding all of the strategy and genius that went in and led up to um, that event, right? And all the people that were involved. And we diminish Rosa's own role by making her seem passive. Um, we failed to tell some of the most sacred stories, and it's understandable, right? There's a historical trauma that is also exists that makes it, even in my own family, people not want to talk about the lynchings that happen, not want to talk about the struggles that happen, wanting to bury or put aside all the things that come with having a history of trauma. Right? Folks in trauma tend to um, from a historical sense, be overexposed to some of the worst that humanity has to offer. I have uncles and cousins and family members who have developed some really deep psychosis, um, I have older family members who just want to get rid of their past in Mississippi and don't want to talk about all those things. They say, they only want to look forward into a future, but the future that they articulate doesn't reflect who we are and what we do as a community practice. And so there's tension there, especially with younger folks who want to go back and get that history and be able to tell and speak that truth. Um, I've also experienced that members of my own family and in community who disassociate with a connection at all to the continent of Africa. I actually have family members and students in my programs who will debate um, their African part of their identity. They're saying, I'm not African American. I'm nothing to do with Africa. I'm black. How do we unpack that? And what does that mean? And what are we telling ourselves and our children when we have that particular mindset, right? And I start to see anti-blackness rise up in a historical sense in that regard. The other piece that comes up for me in a historical sense is losing what we've done in various periods. This is in particular in my Christian context. I will preach um, and explain and go over some history in detail that we don't know and haven't gotten because our school systems aren't keeping up with it. And I'm finding that it's way too easy to tell a compelling story, historical story that nobody's heard. And it's not a matter of having amassed a whole bunch of information, like just a cursory research um, pulls together a much richer story and a whole lot of different on a whole lot of different historical topics. And you just hint at them enough, a little bit, and folks are hungry and craving and thirsting for it, which is good on one hand, but on the other hand, this is stuff we should already know, and so there's a particular tension in there for me, and that leads to the second issue in the context, and that is the identity side, right? How do we build a collective and a more individual or group oriented ethnic identity space without an understanding of some of the historical things that have come here, right? If we don't understand that 80% of captive Africans were brought to the Caribbean and South America, then our conversation on Black experience being limited to the United States is extremely limiting if we want, for folks who want to reach out for a Pan-African sense. For folks who just want to have a sense of, I made this world, right? That I have the ability and the agency to make a world and contribute to it and have those contributions matter. Well, they have mattered for thousands and thousands of years. But if you hear the history as we're giving it to it in school, in our world history, whatever class or school experience you've had, we don't get these rich histories of scientific advancement interrupted by colonialism. We get there were some folks in Africa who existed, and then we get all this information about enlightenment and scientific advancement out of Europe as an engine, and none of the information about how African societies that predate all of modern Greece and all of that were contributing in developing these things, and that without them, there would have been no advancement in the European side. Now, it's not shortchanging anybody from the history. We got to be thankful for the Industrial Revolution. We got to be thankful for all of the advancements that we have that make our modern comforts. But we also have to be honest. And if we don't do that, then we walk forward with an identity that there were people in Africa who were backwards, and then Europe brought civilization. That just is not going to fly in our current context. And it causes youth in particular to see themselves not as part of their world. And so, given that the historical piece and the identity piece, and even the struggles across our identities about how do we call ourselves, how do we engage, how do we learn about each other in our own Pan-African space, I imagine then as a utopia, one where there was never European interruption. I imagine a utopia where there are egalitarian societies who are bringing their culture and their scientific advancements together, and that the thought and philosophy economy is the thing that drives. That is the driving seat of the civilization. That there, the universities at Timbuktu and the Ulam in the Muslim caliphates, and this premium on knowledge, that being the economy, right? That knowledge leading towards that knowledge is the big get. And what happens is that's driven is we now have societies who are looking egalitarian um, or looking equitably at making sure that everybody's talents are pulled forward. That I'm looking for a youth growing up. I'm looking to see where are your proclivities, what area of advancement and knowledge do you want to unpack and dig deeper further, and then I push you and steer you towards that. And so we end up looking a lot more like Star Trek Next Generation because I'm a blurred in that everybody then will starts to look at their areas that they're going to contribute to the broader community. And so now we have an egalitarian space. I also see it as an environmentally friendly space that we evaporative cooling, which is done in the Songhai civilization thousands of years before refrigeration units. Um, I would see those things advancing to being able to pull water out of the atmosphere in arid areas, to look at irrigation and letting natural irrigation happening because we don't need to rely on that for our water source. Harnessing wave energy, harnessing solar, geothermal, and all those types of things, so that we end up with a society that's much cleaner and doesn't output, right? There are hundreds of years of documents that look at the addressing of waste in particular areas across the continent. Waste was handled very succinctly because there was an understanding for hundreds of thousands of years, not hundreds of thousands, but hundreds of years and even thousands of years, that germs or something like germs cause disease. And so you would need to quarantine and not expose folks to certain diseases. There was even a practice of inoculation. So if there were small scale diseases, because people began to track these things back in the day, where if I get exposed to this smaller disease, I won't get this larger disease over here. So that practice is there. There's a reason why Africans were more resilient to European diseases and diseases in multiple climates because there had been a practice. And so I see that being advanced all the way to the future of a society that then is able to cure and handle health crises in ways that we aren't seeing now. So I see that as part of the utopia. From a governance standpoint, I see multiple communities of groups forming more parliamentarian and exchange systems where smaller communities handle conflict on their own, and our larger trade and disputes are focused on leaving folks whole. How do we make sure that we're all whole? And this is a practice that was done in many different areas and is brought to us by our Eastern African brothers and sisters, particularly in the Muslim communities, who are looking at trade, leaving folks whole. That way, there's no conflict, and that conflict or wars or border disputes are handled in a communal restorative sense. And then, lastly, in terms of outwardly, that there would be very specific requirements for who we trade with. That just like in Black Panther, that proclivity to hold insularly. I don't necessarily agree there, but when we do reach out and establish relationships, it's one that come with our own humanitarian beliefs. Lastly, the society that I imagine is matriarchal. I just, given the history of men, I would love to see more. And there's many societies that were matriarchal in African history. That there's a more matriarchal sense. They tended to have war less. They tended to dispute less and get those disputes handled in a much more collective and egalitarian way. And so I definitely see the society being much more matriarchal, in which the leadership and the keepers of wisdom and the skill sets inherent in the feminine identities, whether it's in a masculine body or not, that becomes what we rely on. So relying on the feminine for reason, and for that type of engagement and collectiveness. That's the society that I imagine. Again, I'm Anthony Galloway. I'm a unapologetic black male in St. Paul.